What's up, Psychedelic Spotlight? It's your boy James coming back at you with a brand new episode. I'm super excited for today's episode because we actually have Carol Routledge, who is the Chief Medical and Chief Scientific Officer of small pharma, ticker symbol DMT and DMTTF in the United States. Now, everybody that's watching this program probably already knows that of all the psychedelic compounds, I am most excited and fascinated by the compound of dimethyltryptamine, DMT. So in this interview, we're going to get into what small pharma is actually working on, what actually is DMT, and why is it so exciting. So Carol, thank you so much for being with us today. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Thank you for having me on the program. Really nice to meet you.
Oh, well, I have been excited to talk to small pharma for the longest time, so I am very, very excited to have you on. So I guess right off the bat, why don't you just give a little quick rundown of what small pharma is actually working on when it comes to DMT and treating depression?
So Small Pharma is a neuropharmaceutical company, so we are focused on developing treatments for mental health disorders, and particularly at the minute our focus is on DMT-assisted therapy. So Small Pharma have started their first clinical trial to evaluate DMT-assisted therapy, both in healthy volunteers, and I'll explain the study in a moment, and in patients with major depressive disorder. So this trial started in January. It's actually two trials rolled into one. And the reason we set it up like that is so as soon as we had the data and the safety and the tolerability results from the first part of the trial, we could roll it straight over into our efficacy study in patients. So the first part of the trial was really focused on understanding the tolerability and safety to a certain extent. There's quite a lot of safety data out there, but largely the tolerability data associated with different doses of DMT, with the aim of understanding that at those doses that elicit a full and breakthrough psychedelic experience, the tolerability of the molecule. So we conducted this first part of the study in psychedelic naive healthy volunteers. And the reason for psychedelic naive healthy volunteers is that we think, I guess, know that a lot of patients are going to be psychedelic naive. And so we really wanted to understand tolerability in that population. So that part of the trial is completed. So that completed in August of this year, extremely successful. And we demonstrated that all the way up to the top dose that we administered, DMT is very, very well tolerated in that subject population. But also we were able to give doses that elicited a full and breakthrough psychedelic experience. And so we've been able to take a dose from the first part of the study and roll it directly into the second part of the study, which is a placebo-controlled, randomized, blinded efficacy study in patients with major depressive disorder. That has started. We've dosed a number of patients already, and we hope to have headline data in the first half of next year. So really exciting for us. I think it's the first formal and regulated study on DMT in patients with major depressive disorder, and I guess we'll see how it goes.
Alrighty, so just to quickly recap what you said and tell me if I get any details wrong. So Small Pharma was doing a phase 1A/2A, or 1/2A clinical trial, which essentially means that once you're done the first part, which is traditionally focused on safety and tolerability, you can move directly into the phase 2A section of the trial. So you completed the phase 1 section of the trial, and you saw that, as was expected, there was a positive safety profile. There was no serious adverse events. Nobody went crazy or anything. And based on this positive data, you were able to move directly into the phase 2A section of the trial, which is the first ever, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the first ever phase 2A clinical trial that's looking into DMT. And this will be specific towards treating, or attempting to treat rather, people with major depressive disorder. Did I get all that right?
You got it spot on. That's very, very well said.
Perfect. So I guess my next question would be, why DMT? Why not psilocybin like Compass is doing, or why not LSD like MindMed is doing? Why focus on dimethyltryptamine?
So Small Pharma focused on DMT for a number of different reasons, but one key reason was the short psychedelic experience. And this just makes it much more clinically flexible and means we can follow, the clinical kind of protocol that's already out there, or a standard treatment that's out there. But in addition to it having a short psychedelic experience, based on human research, and particularly using imaging data, we do expect DMT to do exactly the same as psilocybin does, but over a 6 to 8 hour period. So we should still see the full therapeutic benefit of DMT, even though the psychedelic experience is short. And then just quickly to add to that, in addition to that, there is quite a lot of academic research data out of there, both on DMT, both in humans, but also in preclinical species as well, which kind of lends support that DMT with therapy is likely to show antidepressant activity.
So I just want to zero in on the first thing that you said there, because I think it's really important, and viewers of this channel will be aware of this theme, this topic. But one of the major stumbling blocks when it comes to psychedelic therapies, when we're speaking specifically about psilocybin or LSD, is the long duration of effect of these compounds. If you have to be, and this is an issue because if you have to be watched over by a therapist for 6 to 8 to 10 hours in some cases, that could be very, very expensive and price out a lot of people. It's not a very accessible model unless the government is paying for it. Just having, a lot of people won't be able to afford that long stay within a therapist's office. So if we can have something that has the same effects but has a shorter duration effect, and that can be maybe a modified psilocybin or a compound that already exists like DMT, if it is equally as effective, then it seems like it's a better drug candidate, in my opinion, and I guess in your guys' opinion too, because that's exactly what you were working on. So why don't we shift gears a little bit, because the DMT that you guys are using in your clinical trial, it's your own proprietary formulation, correct? It's something called SPL026. So could you just talk a little bit about SPL026 and how it differs from DMT that somebody may drink in ayahuasca or may smoke in a powder format?
So SPL026 is DMT. So I guess the main difference is that we've manufactured it using a novel synthetic route to GMP quality and made it into a salt form, so that our drug product is DMT fumarate. It's a salt form that is then we're able to administer to healthy volunteers and to patients. So it's really around the synthetic route and then the purity of the molecule we've made. It is very different, I hasten to add. So it's not too different from DMT, but it's very different from ayahuasca. So ayahuasca is a combination of DMT, but also other active products called harmalines that inhibit the enzyme that breaks down DMT in the body. So actually it's a real different kind of complex mixture of compounds. But SPL026 is DMT fumarate. And
so this is being administered how? It's through an IV, correct?
It's through a bespoke IV infusion. That's absolutely correct for these clinical trials. So one of the benefits of giving an IV infusion is that you have 100% bioavailability. So that means the amount of drug you give is there in the systemic circulation. Whereas if you give DMT orally, it's not active. And if you give it through any other route, then you don't get 100% in the bloodstream. But IV you do. And so that means you can titrate your doses exactly and know exactly how much DMT is in the body. So yes, in our first clinical trials, we're giving this via intravenous infusion.
Okay, so when it comes to DMT and the duration of effect, it almost seems like at times that there is the opposite problem of when it comes to psilocybin, in that psilocybin is too long, but oftentimes the DMT trip can be very short. So I know you guys are working on another DMT compound, which will go into phase 1 clinical trials next year, I believe, called SPL028. Can you talk a little bit about what makes SPL028 special and maybe compare it to SPL026?
So you're right. We have, in fact, SPL028 is a number of compounds, but we will select the one that we will. In fact, we have selected the one that we're going to take towards the clinic, and the difference is, and in fact, you've mentioned it, is that those follow-on molecules, based on how we've chemically modified them, are likely to have a slightly longer half-life. Now, I don't mean a half-life of 4, 5, 6 hours, taking it to a psilocybin-like molecule, but we will tweak the half-life. And the key reasons for that, there are twofold. So one is it's trying to optimize that psychedelic experience. But the other aspect is it's trying to optimize the formulation that we administer to healthy volunteers and to patients. So, it could potentially deliver an orally dosed molecule, or a molecule dosed by some other injection route, or inhaled. So it helps to develop a different formulation for administration of the molecules. Those molecules are in preclinical development at the moment, but as you say, we plan to take our first candidate into the clinic in 2022.
So if SPL028 is shown in human clinical trials to be equally as effective as SPL026, is this the molecule of the future? Eventually you'll stop using 026 and switch over to 028?
So that's a possibility, but there are other possibilities which are critically dependent, as you say, on the clinical profile of the different molecules. Because you give it via a different route, and because it may have a slightly different half-life, so the length of time it stays in the body, then actually the profiles might be quite different. So once we start to get the clinical data back from these molecules, we can start to understand or make exactly the decision as you say. And it is possible that molecules administered by a different route may be more beneficial for different indications, whether that be substance abuse or anxiety disorders or other depressive disorders or PTSD. So again, as we move through our clinical trials, we will really start to understand the profile of these molecules, both in terms of eliciting a psychedelic experience, the quality and intensity of the psychedelic experience, and then in turn, how beneficial that is for what indication. And we have to build up that picture.
Okay. So why don't you walk me through for a moment?
Sorry, the light's gone out. There we go. Sorry,
no worries. Were you able to turn it on with your hands there?
I was. I just went like
magic. Yeah. So anyhow, why don't we walk through what I'm blanking on a word here. Let's say I have depression for a moment, and I want to get treated using your regime, your regimen. So how exactly would it work? Is there multiple sessions with a therapist? Is it all done in one session? Just what is the process?
So again, we are working that in the clinical trials, but let me give you an anticipated patient journey that we are trying to mirror in our clinical trial. So the patient will obviously be prescribed this treatment. So for that, they need to be screened. They'll be screened by a psychiatrist or GP and then psychiatrist, and then they will be prescribed this treatment. The expectation is that they will go to a dosing room, potentially something like a ketamine dosing room, and they will, with a therapist present. So there will be a therapist in the dosing room, and if we have to give it by IV administration, or depending on how we have to administer it, there may be a clinical staff there as well. But certainly there will be a therapist there. And then so they go to the dosing room, and then they have the administration of the pharmaceutical, so of DMT, but surrounded by the therapy. So the initial part of the therapy, which is called the preparation or the set, will help the patient prepare for the DMT experience. So first of all, that therapy will ensure that the patient feels safe, they're comfortable, they're not anxious. But importantly, it would also help them to to embrace and keep an open mind to the psychedelic experience. So you really want the patient to embrace that experience rather than try and resist it. And that's the importance of the preparation therapy beforehand. That usually takes 15 to 20 minutes, and that's what we're doing in our trials. Then you will get DMT administration, and the psychedelic experience lasts somewhere between 20, 25, 30 minutes. And during that time, the therapist is silent. So of course they're there, they're supporting the patient, they may be holding their hand, but they're not giving any therapy. And then immediately after the psychedelic experience, then the therapist gives the integration therapy. And that's also for a few different reasons. So one, it helps the patient to make sense of the psychedelic experience that they've just gone through. And they talk about, some of the deep-seated issues that they may have. But also therapeutically, we really think that it helps to cement those new connections. So we think that during the psychedelic experience. There's an increase in brain plasticity. Based on imaging data, it appears that you get an increase in excitability, an increase in connections. And so this therapy really helps to start to cement those down too, and it helps the patient to leave in a positive frame of mind. So it's that wraparound therapy with the pharmaceutical in the middle. Altogether, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, sorry.
Altogether, that takes anywhere between an hour and a half, I guess, and 2 hours, or an hour and a half to 2.5 hours. But again, we will map that out in the clinical trials as we move forward.
So what I was going to ask, and I know that perhaps it might be a little bit too early to know the answer to this, but do you envision this being a one and done type treatment, or do you envision that people might have to come back once a month, twice a year, and have some sort of continued regimen? Or do you really believe that this is going to be a one-time experience and that's all you need?
So at the moment, I think our anticipation is that it won't be a one-time experience, but again, we don't know that. We think there may be up to 3 treatments a year. Again, the clinical trials will help us to understand that. But in addition to that, patients may need additional therapy sessions once they've had this treatment. But in terms of that...
Non-psychedelic therapy sessions.
Sorry? Yeah, so non-psychedelic, therapy sessions. So in addition to that treatment, which is the preparation, the psychedelic, and then the integration, they may need additional non-psychedelic therapy sessions. But we anticipate, and of course it depends on exactly how long the duration of antidepressant activity is likely to be. So we do anticipate an almost immediate onset of antidepressant effect, and then we anticipate a long duration of effect. But it depends whether that's 3 months or 4 months or 5 months, and that will dictate whether they need another treatment session within that year or another 2. So this really has all to be determined, and I can't really say more than that. I mean, ideally, it's a few dosing sessions, very few dosing sessions a year, but yeah, we need to determine that really.
So just something to point out in your phase 2A clinical trial that I really like is that you do have multiple follow-up sessions with the people at different month intervals, going all the way up to 6 months out. So I feel like once we eventually get to see that data in like a year, 2 years, I'm not sure exactly when we can see that 6-month data, that will be really important for us, the general public, and obviously for your company to be able to gauge how long-lasting DMT therapy might be.
You're absolutely right. So in terms of the assessments that we do after the treatment, even though our primary endpoint, so I guess the most critical endpoint in terms of what we're evaluating in the trial is 2 weeks, we're also evaluating patients at 1 week, so we can determine the rapidity of onset of antidepressant effects. But then you're right, we're also assessing them at 1 month, at 3 months, and then out of study at 6 months. So that should give us a really good handle on just how long the antidepressant effect is expected to last or predicted to last.
And how many people are in this trial again? It's like 40, I believe, right?
So there are 42 patients in the trial, but there are 2 components to the trial. So the first part of the trial is the blinded efficacy assessment, where there are 21 patients on active treatment with therapy and 21 patients on placebo with therapy. Once they get to the primary endpoint, then they're all rolled over into an open label where they receive active. And the reason that we're doing that is twofold, really. So one, it's around, I guess, the ethical aspects for the patient. So everybody knows they will have the opportunity to have active, and then that may help to alleviate a disappointment effect if patients think, they won't know for definite, but if they think they're on placebo. But then secondly, it also helps us to inform our next phase 2B trial. So it tells us whether 2 doses separated by 2 weeks is more efficacious than 1 dose. And it also tells us something about the tolerability of 2 doses versus 1 dose. So a number of different reasons we had that trial design.
Okay, so I got a question for you based on something you just said. How in the heck do we create a placebo for DMT? Like, I can't imagine that somebody sitting there either wouldn't know or would know, or that they wouldn't know whether or not they got the placebo or actual DMT. So what is this placebo?
So patients will know if they have a psychedelic experience. I don't think there's any way they will not know if they have a psychedelic experience. So there is obviously an unblinding if patients know they've had a psychedelic experience. if they have placebo, and actually placebo is just the vehicle that the active drug is in, so there's no low dose at the moment. In this particular trial, it's just placebo, and I can explain why we took that approach in a second. But they won't absolutely know they're on placebo, in that based on the, you know, that you have an eye mask on, you have earphones on, so you're kind of taken a little bit away from where you are anyway. But also they could potentially have a blunted affected treatment. So whilst if you have a psychedelic experience, you know you've had a psychedelic experience, you don't absolutely know you're on placebo. But the way that we've managed to blind the study is that all of the clinical assessors who assess the efficacy endpoints and the safety endpoints, they are blinded to treatment. So they will not be in the treatment room when the patient is treated. And then the questions that you ask in terms of assessing the efficacy, none of them allude back to the treatment. So the clinical assessors are all blinded, even if the patient is unblinded because they have a psychedelic experience.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah.
I know I've read this one way or the other, but I forget. Are the people that are in your trial, they're all psychedelic inexperienced, or there are some people that are in the trial that have experienced psychedelics before?
So in the phase 1 study, all of them were psychedelic naive healthy volunteers. In the phase 2A study, patients can have taken a psychedelic in the past, but that has to be at least 6 months ago. So for patients, we are enrolling both. We expect the majority to be psychedelic naive, but we are not excluding somebody who's taken a psychedelic at least 6 months ago.
Okay. Shifting gears a little bit, and I absolutely have to ask you this question because you're a scientist, so hopefully you can shine some light on it. What the heck is happening in the brain when you experience a quote unquote breakthrough experience? Is this all just neurochemistry that's happening, something similar to when you're in like REM sleep, or could there be something more to this experience, or is it completely all materialistic, it's happening in the brain?
So I think, I mean, you know, lots of people have different opinions about this. Lots of people have different opinions whether a conscious psychedelic experience is even necessary. And lots of people have opinions on whether it's necessary for some, but not all therapeutic indications. So I trained as a neuropharmacologist. I did my PhD in neuropharmacology before I moved into the biotech and pharma industry. And so, yes, it is driven by pharmacology. So you know, we believe that the you know, some of the effects of psychedelics are mediated through various networks in the brain, and one that I'm sure you've heard of is called the default mode network. I think other ones will be involved, and we believe that's overactive in depression and in other internalizing disorders, and potentially that is what causes this cycling negative ruminative thought processes, which kind of cause these ingrained inflexible neural connections. And so we think psychedelics modulate those, one, because they suppress that hyperactivity, and that's what some of the imaging data is starting to support, but two, through stimulation of various different 5-HT receptors, and clearly including 5-HT2A, but maybe 1A, maybe 7, maybe 6, so a number of them, they cause this brain plasticity, which also helps to increase the flexibility of those ingrained pathways. So, you know, non-scientifically, it is this resetting. Scientifically, it is caused by the pharmacology, but it is this resetting that we then think allows therapy to be much more effective. So it kind of makes the mind much more receptive to the therapy, which is why it's called psychedelic assisted therapy. And so we think it facilitates the therapy bit. But do I think it's mediated through pharmacology? Yes, I do. But I'm not saying that everybody else does.
Yeah, one of the things that originally fascinated me so much about DMT a few years ago when I first started learning about it was how congruent so many people's personal experiences, subjective experiences seem to be compared to other psychedelics, in that if you take a little bit of it, you see you get the quote unquote like the world is realer than real effect. If you take a little bit more, it seems like most people enter some sort of tunnel. And then if you take even more, you have the breakthrough experience where you essentially enter, at least subjectively, it's how a lot of people describe it, you enter some sort of other realm where there are autonomous beings. And it was the the frequency at which people were describing what sounded like more or less the same experience that personally got me really thinking about like what the heck this could be. So I guess my question here is, have you ever, either through small pharma or elsewhere, looked into and studied the subjective experiences that people are undergoing?
So clearly through the trial that we're conducting now, and at the moment there's a lot of the phase 1 data is still blinded, but we will explore that. So there are a whole host of questionnaires that we have subjects fill out, and then also during the integration therapy you can question them and they'll kind of talk to, not to us, but talk to clinical people about their psychedelic experience, which you're right is very subjective. Going back to your question around, you know, if you take a dose and you take a little bit more and you take a little bit more, then your psychedelic experience may be different. You know what, that's no different from any other pharmacological drug. If you take a small dose and you start to tickle, sorry, it's gone. If you take a small dose and you start to tickle a number of receptors, so you stimulate them a little bit, then you get certain pharmacological effects. If you give a higher dose and you stimulate them more and maybe bring in a few additional ones, you'll get a different pharmacological effect, and so on. And that's why it's so important within a clinical trial setting to really understand safety, tolerability, and psychedelic experience in terms of intensity, quality, subjective effect, like you say, so that we can determine which we think is the right dose to take forward into the efficacy studies. But it is just pharmacology. And you know, in the phase 1 study, we didn't go to the maximum tolerated dose because that's not what we wanted to do. We just wanted to understand the dose that elicits a breakthrough psychedelic experience and is well tolerated. But it's just pharmacology. So you're just stimulating different numbers of receptors and potentially different types. And whilst I cannot categorically state this, one of the reasons for the differences in the psychedelic experience elicited by different compounds, different molecules, is probably due to that polypharmacology that you see across those receptors, as well as the different route of administration.
Perfect. So I guess one of my last questions here would be, no luck with the lights, eh?
Oh, there we go.
There we go. Let there be light.
I'm so sorry.
No worries, no worries. Yeah, so do you think then if in the future at some point you guys or whoever else were able to create a DMT that had the same pharmacological effects in the brain but somehow circumvented the psychedelic experience completely, do you think that that would be equally as effective, or do you think that there might be something in the experience that people undergo?
So I think those companies that are looking to try and understand you know, which receptors are key for therapeutic efficacy and which by default almost cause a psychedelic experience, I think that's, that approach is really interesting. At the moment, we can't determine that because it's kind of a moot point in that all the psychedelics hit the receptors they hit. And so as you move forward, if you want to use pharmacological doses, they're going to cause a psychedelic experience. So maybe the only way you can determine if the conscious psychedelic experience is important is maybe, I don't know, sedate them while they go through a psychedelic experience and see. I think it's a really difficult thing to do, but I think it remains to be determined. And actually, you probably need to avoid the receptors that are most linked to the psychedelic experience, and 5-HT2A is one of those. Whether you will still get the therapeutic benefit if you reduce the affinity of these new molecules for the 5-HT2A receptor, I don't think any of us know yet. And I think what makes this approach so difficult is that you, whilst in preclinical models, you can determine whether you've reduced 5-HT2A affinity or not, and whether in preclinical models you still have a pharmacodynamic effect. That's doable. But ultimately, you have to take these molecules all the way through phase 1 to measure the psychedelic experience, and then all the way through phase 2A trials for efficacy. So you have to go quite a ways through before you know that reducing certain, you know, pharmacology at certain receptors will prove to give you the molecule you want. You know, if you can, is that beneficial? I mean, it has to be beneficial in that you don't, you know, require the intensity of therapies you need. Saying that though, if it's still about the resetting of the brain, and it's still about drug-assisted therapy, then it's still possible you need that wraparound therapy anyway to really help the patients have this kind of brain reset, and then the therapy afterwards. So it may not help you on that front, but, you know, I guess it's certainly, you know, some patients won't want to have a psychedelic experience. I think lots of patients look at the psychedelic experience as a means to an end. I want this treatment because I think it's going to work for me, so I am willing to go through a psychedelic experience. But you are right, it may limit the treatment for some patients because they don't want it. And so these newer molecules, if they work in the same way, and if they provide that therapeutic benefit, maybe for certain patients they will be more beneficial.
Well, it's exciting times, and I am really looking forward to following your company, Small Pharma, over the next 3, 4, 5, 6 years, because I think that you guys are really onto something when it comes to focusing on DMT as opposed to some of the other classical psychedelics. Carol, is there anything else that you would like to mention about either DMT, the drug, or the company?
No, I don't think so, other than, you know, the data will come out. The data will be what it is. So we will run these clinical trials. We will understand the appropriate doses of DMT to give to patients with therapy. And hopefully we will be able to demonstrate the efficacy not only in depression, but also in other internalizing conditions as well. And I really hope for patients this works. You know, nothing works in everybody. Nothing works in everybody. But as a minimum, it will give patients another choice. And it will give patients a choice that we think will really get to the root cause of the problem.
Perfect. So if people want to learn more about Small Pharma, where can they do so?
They can do so on our website. So if they visit our website, and they can also learn a little bit more about the trials. And if they want to come to the trial, they can. That's also on our website.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. I had a blast, Carol. I absolutely love talking about DMT. So it is great to speak with an expert about it. Thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thank you. Great to talk to you, James. Thank you.